What do we do with stories that refuse to stay buried? Not rumors, not fantasies, but fragments of stone, clay, bone, and metal lifted from the earth by ordinary hands again and again across deserts, caves, riverbeds, and forgotten hillsides. People have uncovered objects that seem to arrive from the wrong century or the wrong civilization or the wrong idea of history itself. And just as often, those objects slipped into silence. History likes clean lines. It prefers beginnings and endings that can be taught in a classroom, printed in a museum guide, or repeated until they feel permanent. Yet the ground beneath us is not orderly. It keeps its own record. A shard appears where no shard should be. An inscription survives in a language thought impossible. A crafted object turns up in a layer of earth that seems to deny its very existence. For a brief moment, certainty trembles. This is not a story about proving every mystery true. Many strange discoveries invite doubt, and doubt has its place. Archaeology at its best depends on caution, but caution can harden into habit, and habit into refusal. Sometimes the most revealing part of a discovery is not the object itself, but the reaction that follows. The locked drawer, the delayed report, the vanished archive, the quiet warning to let the matter go. So we begin here, at the edge between evidence and discomfort. In the chapters ahead, we will follow 10 discoveries that stirred wonder and suspicion in equal measure. Some may be misunderstood, some may be genuine anomalies. All of them reveal something larger than themselves. How fragile our confidence can be when the past stops behaving the way we expect. Because the deepest mystery may not be what was found, but why uncertainty can feel so threatening when it rises from the dust. What if the past first returned not as a monument, but as a sentence carved into stone? In the dry light of New Mexico, a hillside can look like a closed book. Scrub, dust, volcanic rock, and silence, huh? Then someone notices a surface that has been speaking all along. In the 1930s, a professor named Frank Hibben came upon a great boulder near Los Lunas, marked with an inscription that seemed to echo from another world. The lines resembled ancient Hebrew. Not modern imitation, not decorative scratching, but something older in spirit and structure, as if an argument had been left behind by time itself. If the inscription was authentic, its meaning reached far beyond language. It suggested not just a traveler, but a crossing, not just contact, but memory. For scholars shaped by a familiar chronology of the Americas, that possibility felt less like an addition to history than a disturbance of it. And when a discovery unsettles an established story, the first response is not always wonder. Sometimes it is discomfort disguised as caution. Hibben documented what he saw. He photographed the stone, shared notes, and tried to invite discussion. But the reaction around him cooled quickly. Questions multiplied, yet not all of them were directed at the carving. Some were aimed at the risk of taking it seriously. The site remained, weathering under open sky, while the debate around it narrowed into something quieter and more personal. How much uncertainty can a career survive? Years passed, the stone remained where it was, exposed to sun, erosion, and the slow abrasion of doubt. Some experts found reasons to keep looking. Others treated the entire matter as a curiosity best left at the edge of scholarship. And so the inscription entered that strange half-life shared by many troubling artifacts, visible yet somehow unseen. Perhaps that is how history protects itself. Not always by erasing a thing, but by teaching us not to linger before it too long. It began in a cave where the air itself seemed ancient. Deep in the Nevada desert, beyond the glare of open land, Lovelock Cave held the layered remains of lives once lived close to water, reeds, birds, and fire. The place was not grand in the usual sense. No towering temple, no golden chamber, just dust, woven fragments, tools, bone, and the ordinary evidence of human survival. Yet ordinary places are often where history becomes most intimate and most difficult to ignore. Among the materials taken from the cave were reports of objects and remains that did not fit neatly into expectation. Unusually large bones, artifacts tied to oral traditions long dismissed as exaggeration. Hints, however uncertain, that memory had preserved something scholars had learned to file under myth. For local indigenous communities, the cave was never empty ground. It belonged to a living landscape of story, warning, and inheritance. But archaeology, especially in its earlier forms, often listened unevenly. It could measure a skull while overlooking a voice. As excavations expanded in the early 20th century, much of what emerged was boxed, removed, categorized, and sent elsewhere. Some items were preserved. Some accounts became contested almost immediately. Others faded into that gray space between rumor and record. The cave itself remained, but the meaning of what had been found there began to fracture. Was this a site of remarkable continuity between story and artifact? A case of misinterpretation amplified by fascination? Or something more uncomfortable? A reminder that modern scholarship has not always known how to recognize truth when it arrives in unfamiliar language? There is a sadness in that possibility. Not because every extraordinary claim must be accepted, but because the chain between discovery and understanding can break so easily. A bone mislabeled, a testimony dismissed, a collection scattered, and with each break, the past becomes harder to hear. Lovelock Cave asks a quiet question that reaches far beyond its stone walls. When evidence and memory meet, why are we so often tempted to trust only what we can catalog and not what a people has carried for generations? What if the most unsettling discovery is not an object, but the age of a footprint? Along the banks of the Paluxy River in Texas, the earth sometimes opens like wet cement and then hardens into testimony. In the early 20th century, tracks pressed into limestone drew attention from locals, visitors, and eventually a wider public. Some appeared unmistakably human. Others nearby looked reptilian, massive, and ancient beyond comprehension. The temptation was immediate and obvious. To see the two together and imagine a world history larger, stranger, and more tangled than the one most people had inherited. But footprints are deceptive things. They invite interpretation because they seem so intimate. A track is not a tool or a monument. It feels like a direct encounter, the mark of a living body moving through mud under open sky. That closeness can make us trust what we see before we have fully understood it. At Paluxy, excitement spread faster than careful analysis. Casts were made. Claims hardened. Counterclaims followed. Some tracks proved altered by erosion. Others may have been elongated or misread. A few became symbols in battles they were never meant to fight. Yet beneath the controversy lies a more human story. People were not only arguing about stone impressions, they were arguing about authority, about who gets to describe reality when the evidence seems to shift underfoot. Scientists returned with new methods and more restrained conclusions. Enthusiasts held to older interpretations. Between them sat the river itself, patient and indifferent, wearing away both certainty and spectacle. In time, the site became known less for what it definitively proved than for what it revealed about us. We long for discoveries that can settle the largest questions in a single stroke. We want one dramatic image to redeem doubt, but the past rarely speaks so cleanly. More often, it offers fragments, ambiguous and weathered, asking us to live with complexity rather than conquest. Perhaps that is the deeper lesson of Paluxy. Not that history is simple or false, but that our hunger for final answers can leave prints of its own, shaped as much by desire as by stone. It started with a map no one expected to matter so much. In 1929, inside the quiet rooms of Istanbul's Topkapi Palace, a fragment of painted gazelle skin drew fresh attention. It was part of an Ottoman chart created by the Admiral Piri Reis in the early 16th century, a work already remarkable for its craftsmanship and geographic ambition. Coastlines curled across the surface with elegant certainty. Islands hovered in ink. Notes crowded the margins like whispers from vanished sailors. At first glance, it seemed like a relic of navigation. Then people began asking a more unsettling question. How had one man assembled a view of the world that appeared, in places, oddly ahead of its time? Part of the fascination came from what the map seemed to imply. It drew on older sources, some known, some lost. Piri Reis himself said as much, describing a patchwork of charts gathered from earlier voyages and traditions. In that admission lies the real mystery. Not whether the map proves some grand hidden civilization, but how much knowledge disappears between generations without ever making a sound. We tend to imagine progress as a straight road, yet this fragment suggests a coastline of memory, broken, inherited, revised, and sometimes forgotten. As scholars studied the chart, arguments multiplied. Some saw echoes of ordinary cartographic guesswork. Others believed certain features hinted at information that should not have been available in 1513. Over time, speculation often ran far ahead of evidence. But skepticism, too, could become reductive, as if the only safe response to mystery were dismissal. Between those extremes sat the map itself, beautiful, incomplete, and stubbornly alive. Its power may lie less in what it proves than in what it exposes. Every archive is also a graveyard of missing pages. Every confident history rests on absences we rarely see. The Piri Reis Map reminds us that the past was once global in ways our textbooks flattened, carried by traders, sailors, interpreters, and copyists whose names vanished while their knowledge endured in fragments. And perhaps that is the haunting thought. How much of what humanity once knew survives only as a shape at the edge of the page, waiting for someone to notice it again? What if a small sphere could carry the weight of an impossible memory? In the high plains of South Africa, miners have long cut into rocks so old it almost escapes imagination. These formations belong to a world far older than cities, older than mammals, older than almost everything we associate with human history. And from those depths came reports of metallic-looking spheres, some marked by grooves so regular they seemed crafted rather than formed. The objects were modest in size, easy to hold in one hand, yet their quiet geometry opened a door to extravagant questions. To some observers, the spheres looked like evidence misplaced in time, artifacts from a forgotten intelligence, or a chapter of Earth's story we had not yet learned to read. To geologists, the answer was far less dramatic and far more grounded. Natural concretions shaped by mineral processes over immense spans of time. Iron and pyrite can produce forms that appear designed, especially when the human mind is so fluent in pattern. A line becomes an incision. Symmetry becomes intention. Mystery becomes manufacture. And still the fascination endured. Perhaps because the spheres touched something larger than the usual contest between belief and skepticism. They reminded us how little scale fits inside the human imagination. A rock can be older than language. A mineral seam can preserve forms that resemble art without ever having known a hand. Nature itself can seem to imitate intelligence, not to deceive us, but to reveal how narrow our categories sometimes are. There is no shame in being startled by such objects. Wonder is not the enemy of reason. In fact, wonder often begins where certainty loosens its grip. The danger lies in rushing too quickly toward either conclusion, declaring miracle or dismissal before we have sat long enough with the object in front of us. The South African spheres ask for a slower kind of attention, one that respects both evidence and astonishment. Maybe that is their true gift, not proof of a hidden civilization, but a more humbling realization that the Earth has been making strange and beautiful things for longer than human thought has had names for them. It began with a mechanism pulled from the sea, green with corrosion and silent for 2,000 years. In 1901, sponge divers working off the Greek island of Antikythera surfaced with the usual signs of danger and luck: exhausted lungs, trembling hands, and fragments from a shipwreck strewn across the seabed. Among the bronze statues, pottery, and luxury goods was a lump of metal so encrusted it seemed almost unremarkable. Only later, when scholars looked closer, did gear teeth emerge from the corrosion like bones from Earth. What had seemed like debris became one of the most astonishing objects ever recovered from the ancient world. The Antikythera mechanism was not just intricate, it was intimate in its intelligence. Inside its bronze casing, interlocking gears modeled the movements of the heavens with a sophistication no one expected from its age. It tracked cycles of the sun and moon. It predicted eclipses. It translated sky into motion, mathematics into metal. In a single object, the ancient world appeared not primitive, but startlingly precise. That revelation forced a change in tone. For generations, history had often been told as a ladder of gradual ascent, with antiquity granted philosophy and beauty, but not machinery of this conceptual depth. The mechanism complicated that story. It suggested traditions of engineering far richer than the surviving record had preserved. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part. Not that one genius object existed, but that it may have belonged to an entire lineage of devices that vanished. Because loss shapes history as powerfully as invention does. Shipwrecks swallow cargo, fires consume libraries, empires fall and take their tools with them. What reaches us is not the complete archive of human ability, but a scattering of survivors. The Antikythera mechanism feels miraculous, partly because it should have had companions, ancestors, descendants, and most of them are gone. So the question it leaves behind is larger than technology. How many times has humanity learned something extraordinary only to lose the chain that carried that knowledge forward? And how different would our sense of the past be if more of those delicate machines had endured the dark, the salt, and the waiting seabed? What if the strangest artifact is one that seems to know the body better than the age around it should? In the dense heat of Colombia's interior, gold does not emerge from the ground as history. It arrives as ornament, offering, inheritance. For centuries, indigenous metalworkers across the region shaped the natural world into forms of startling elegance. Frogs, birds, jaguars, fish, and beings suspended somewhere between the earthly and the symbolic. Then a small group of objects began to attract unusual attention. They were sleek, angular, and unlike the flowing curves most people expected from ancient zoomorphic art. To modern eyes, they looked uncannily aerodynamic. The so-called quimbaya figures and other similar objects invited immediate projection. Some saw fish, others saw insects. Still others, looking through the lens of modern engineering, saw aircraft. Wings appeared sharply set. Tails seemed vertical, bodies narrowed like fuselages. Once that resemblance took hold, it became difficult to unsee. The artifacts moved from museum cases into a wider imagination, where questions of symbolism gave way to speculation about impossible knowledge. Yet this is where the past asked for restraint as much as curiosity. Ancient artists were not designing for our categories. Their works often fused creature, spirit, motion, and abstraction into a single form. What looks technological to us may have been sacred to them, or simply beautiful in a language we no longer fully understand. At the same time, dismissing the resemblance altogether can feel too easy, as if modern discomfort with ambiguity is best solved by flattening the object back into certainty. The deeper story lies in that tension. These figures reveal how interpretation changes with the viewer. Every age carries its own metaphors into the museum. We do not merely look at artifacts. We meet ourselves in them. Our machines shape our imagination just as surely as their myths shape theirs. So perhaps the question is not whether ancient goldsmiths built models of flight. It is whether we are humble enough to admit how quickly the present rearranges the past in its own image, and what truths might still be hidden in forms we think we already recognize. It started in the desert with a Piri Reis scroll and the oldest kind of human hunger, the need to keep a voice alive. In 1947, near the cliffs above the Dead Sea, a young shepherd searching for a stray animal tossed a stone into a cave and heard the sound of breaking pottery. That accidental moment opened one of the most important manuscript discoveries in modern history. Hidden in dry darkness for nearly 2,000 years were scrolls wrapped in linen, copied by careful hands, then sealed away as if someone believed the future might one day need them. And perhaps they were right. The Dead Sea Scrolls carried scripture, commentary, community rules, hymns, and fragments of worlds that had almost vanished. They did not overturn history in one dramatic stroke. Their power was subtler and perhaps more lasting. They revealed that ancient religious life was more textured, more diverse, more alive with debate than many later traditions had remembered. Ideas we often imagine as fixed had once been fluid. Language itself was still in motion. Faith, far from being a finished monument, appeared as a living argument carried across generations. Yet the story of the scrolls was not only about revelation, it was also about access, control, and delay. For years, significant portions remained in the hands of a small circle of scholars. Publication moved slowly. Frustration grew. To some, this caution was understandable, even necessary. To others, it felt like gatekeeping around materials that belonged not just to one institution, but to a much wider human inheritance. The tension was familiar by now. Discovery on one side, authority on the other. But perhaps that tension reveals something essential. Every archive creates a hierarchy of voices, those who preserve, those who interpret, those who must wait to hear. The scrolls survive centuries of heat and empire, only to enter a modern world still struggling over who gets to speak for the past. And that may be their quietest lesson. Truth is rarely lost all at once. More often it is kept at a distance, folded, translated, delayed, until patience, pressure, and time finally allow the old words to breathe again. What if the most revealing discoveries are the ones removed from sight just as people begin to ask better questions? In the deserts and valleys of Peru, burial grounds have yielded objects so finely made they seem to hover between anatomy, ritual, and design. Some were elongated skulls, shaped by deliberate cultural practice and long misunderstood by outsiders as biological anomalies. Others were textiles, ceremonial tools, and worked materials whose meanings had been thinned by distance, stripped from the communities that once knew exactly how to read them. Again and again, the pattern repeated. Excavation, astonishment, transport, interpretation, then silence. There is a temptation, especially in modern storytelling, to treat confiscation as proof that a hidden answer must exist. But reality is often more complex and in some ways more troubling. Objects are removed for reasons both practical and political. Preservation, ownership disputes, colonial habit, private collecting, national control, academic caution. The result, however, can feel the same to the wider public. Something is found, it generates wonder. Then it disappears into storage, litigation, restricted archives, or locked institutional rooms where curiosity cools and memory fades. Peru offers a particularly poignant version of this story because so much of its material past has lived multiple lives. Sacred objects became catalog entries. Community heritage became export inventory. Human remains became evidence and arguments shaped far from the people whose ancestors were being handled. Even when removal was legal or framed as scientific necessity, the emotional consequence endured. A severing between object and living context. Knowledge survived, but often in pieces. This is where the idea of confiscation becomes larger than any single artifact. It is not only about secrecy, it is about who has the power to decide when a discovery becomes public meaning and when it remains suspended in expert language, storage crates, and partial narratives. The past can be taken from the ground in a single afternoon. Understanding takes far longer and is far easier to interrupt. Perhaps that is the deeper unease these stories leave behind. Not that truth is always hidden, but that it can be displaced, handled, renamed, and put just out of reach while the world moves on without it. It began in a cave in China with a thread of color no one expected to survive. The story of the so-called drop of stones has lived for decades in the uneasy space between folklore, misreporting, and desire. According to later retellings, a series of discs marked with spiral grooves were found in remote caves near the Tibetan plateau, accompanied by unusual skeletal remains and claims of a forgotten people. The details shifted with each repetition. Names changed, dates blurred. Sources grew harder to verify the closer one looked. And yet the tale endured, not because it was solid, but because it touched a nerve deep in the modern imagination. The hope that somewhere in some forgotten chamber, history might confess it had been incomplete all along. What makes the Drapa story so revealing is not that it can be neatly confirmed. It cannot. Much of it dissolves under scrutiny. Records are inconsistent. Institutions once cited cannot be reliably connected to the claims. The story behaves less like documented archaeology than like a cultural echo, gathering emotional force as factual footing weakens. In another sense, that makes it even more interesting. It shows how powerfully people are drawn to the possibility of concealed knowledge, especially when official narratives feel distant, impersonal, or overconfident. And still, dismissing such stories entirely may miss the human need beneath them. We do not invent mysteries only to escape reality. Sometimes we create them because reality feels too closed, too curated, too certain to contain the scale of our questions. The Drapa legend offered an opening, however fragile, a way of imagining that the Earth still held messages beyond the reach of institutions, experts, and accepted timelines. In that sense, the story belongs less to archaeology than to modern longing. It tells us what kind of world many people wish might still be possible, one in which wonder has not been fully indexed, and where a cave can still alter the map of meaning per night. Perhaps the real question is not whether the drop of stones were ever what legend claimed. It is why we remain so moved by the idea that somewhere just beyond proof, the past might still be trying to surprise us. What if an artifact can be famous, studied, photographed, and still remain fundamentally unread? On a small island in the Aegean Sea in the early 20th century, workers clearing ancient ruins uncovered a marble figure broken into pieces. At first it looked like another fragment from the long gallery of antiquity, beautiful, damaged, silent. But when the pieces were assembled, the form that emerged was unlike any statue expected from its age. A young man, or perhaps an idealized being, stood with one hand across his torso and the other lifted toward his face. The pose felt strangely modern. The expression felt inward, almost private. This was the Kouros of Delos, and later discoveries like it would keep reminding scholars that even the most familiar civilizations contain unexplained corners. Not every mystery arrives wrapped in controversy. Some enter quietly through style, symbolism, and the unsettling realization that we may not understand the emotional vocabulary of those who came before us. Archaeology is excellent at recovering materials, dates, and trade routes. It is less certain when faced with gesture, mood, and intention. Why this posture? Why this gaze? What ritual, grief, prayer, or performance once gave it meaning? The artifact survives, but the human atmosphere around it is gone. This kind of loss can be harder to accept than physical disappearance. We imagine preservation as rescue, yet preservation often saves only the shell. Museums can protect a surface while severing the object from the sounds, myths, ceremonies, and local memory that once animated it. A statue in a climate-controlled room may be safer than it was in the ground, but it is also lonelier. It has outlived the very world that taught people how to look at it. That is why some discoveries feel confiscated even when they are publicly displayed. They are present but partial, seen but not fully returned to meaning. We can name the marble, date the carving, compare the style, and still remain outside the inner life of the object. Perhaps that is the humbling truth at the center of archaeology. The past is not only hidden in what has been buried. It is hidden in what survives, standing before us in full light, while its deepest significance remains just beyond our grasp. It started, as so many discoveries do, with people looking for one thing and finding another. Across the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists, laborers, shepherds, miners, and divers kept stumbling into objects that complicated the tidy map of human progress. A stone text in the American Southwest, ancient gears in a shipwreck, preserved scrolls in desert caves, gold forms that looked too modern to feel comfortable. Human stories carried in oral tradition, then half recognized in bone and dust. None of these finds meant exactly the same thing. Some proved extraordinary, some remained uncertain. Some may have been misunderstood from the very beginning. Yet together they formed a pattern less about any single artifact than about the fragile relationship between discovery and belief. Because evidence does not arrive in an empty room. It enters institutions, careers, nations, and habits of thought. It meets pride. It meets fear. It meets funding structures, professional caution, and the quiet pressure to protect what already feels settled. In that atmosphere, even honest skepticism can become a gate, and even legitimate preservation can look, from the outside, like disappearance. The object survives. The meaning stalls. Public curiosity is asked to wait. And still, something hopeful runs through all of these stories. Human beings keep searching. We kneel in sand, descend into water, open sealed jars, brush dust from carvings, and lean closer to fragments, because some part of us believes the past is not finished speaking. That instinct is older than science and deeper than spectacle. It is the simple, stubborn conviction that truth is often incomplete, and that wisdom sometimes arrives from the margins of accepted knowledge. If these discoveries teach us anything, it may be this. History is not a locked museum, but an unfinished conversation between what has survived and what we are willing to hear. The greatest danger is not that mystery exists. The greatest danger is that we become so attached to certainty that we stop listening when the evidence grows strange. And that leaves us with one final threshold before the end. When the past unsettles us, do we protect truth by narrowing it or honor it by allowing it to remain larger than our comfort? In the end, these stories are not only about artifacts, they are about us. They are about the way a broken object, lifted from mud or sand, can disturb a settled mind. About how a carving, a mechanism, a scroll, or a rumor of bones can force us to confront the fragility of the stories we depend on. We build history the way we build identity, carefully, selectively, with reverence for what seems to fit. Then something unexpected rises from the earth, and for a moment we remember that the past was never obligated to become simple for our sake. That does not mean every mystery is true in the form it first appears. Some claims collapse under scrutiny. Some discoveries become exaggerated in retelling. Some are shaped by wishful thinking, mistranslation, or the irresistible pull of the extraordinary. But error does not erase the value of wonder. In many cases, it is wonder that begins a search, and discipline that teaches us how to stay with uncertainty long enough to learn from it. What these lost, disputed, delayed, or confiscated objects reveal most clearly is the unfinished nature of human knowledge. We know much. We know more than any generation before us. And yet what survives from the past is only a fraction of what once existed. Libraries burned, oral traditions were ignored, sacred objects were displaced, records vanished. Context was broken. We inherit not a complete memory, but a scattered archive. And perhaps that is why these stories continue to matter. Not because they promise a final revelation, but because they remind us to remain intellectually humble and emotionally open. The past is not dead material. It is a conversation carried through fragments, and every fragment asks something of us: patience, honesty, imagination, restraint. So maybe the deepest truth is this: civilization is not only what we build, it is what we remember, what we lose, and what we are willing to reconsider when the ground gives something back. And the future may depend on whether we greet those returns with fear or with the courage to listen.